I'm here to talk with you about writing a perfect technical tutorial. Um, Really excited to be here virtually again at Write the Docs. One of my favorite conferences of the year. It's second time speaking, so really excited to be here today. My name is Jessica Garson. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm a developer advocate at Twitter, which means I spend a lot of time helping developers connect to the Twitter API, and a lot of times I do that via tutorials. It's kind of become one of my favorite parts of my job is writing tutorials, and I'm here to kind of talk with you a little bit about the process that I use to create tutorials. You could reach out to me via my DMs at Jessica Garson or via my email at jgarson@twitter.com. And if you write any tutorials that you're really excited about, if this talk inspires you to do anything, I would love to see any tutorials that you build, or if you want to ask me questions about your tutorials, I'm here to talk, so feel free to send me an email, reach out to me. Always love to see what you're working on. Today, the structure of this talk is going to be, we're going to talk a little bit about why write a tutorial to begin with, because it's kind of a weird thing to do when you think about it. We'll talk about some questions to ask before you start writing. We will talk a little bit about how to actually get started doing it. This is actually inspired by a talk I gave with a former coworker of mine. I'll give some examples of some tutorials I've seen lately that I really like, that are pretty exciting. We'll talk a little bit about the review process, in terms of editing and peer review and things like that. And then after your tutorial gets published, we'll talk about how to kind of see if it was successful or learn some things and how to kind of give it a life of its own after. And then we'll conclude this talk. Cool. So let's actually go in and get started. So why write a tutorial? Why do this? Like, what is the point? And this is actually something that I kind of struggled with and have struggled with at various times, which is why even do this? I write these things and I'm like, what am I doing? Who's going to read it? And the reason that I end up writing tutorials a lot is because it is a way to kind of guide the reader to doing a specific action. I like to think of it as a way to really get someone started to do something, or to kind of help someone do something easier or work on something that may have been harder to work on without the stress that you've had to experience. And so that's sort of the way that I think about it. A lot of times I also think about it as I am walking the reader through how to write a code sample. For me, writing code was really hard when I got started, and tutorials really helped me get my sea legs and really learn how to write code by following directions. And then once I felt good enough, I was actually very quickly started writing my own tutorials because I wanted folks to experience what I experienced, which is the joy of writing code and making it work. And so tutorials are really part of that process of helping others do a technical action. And so when you're thinking about tutorials, I like to often think about what makes a good topic. And topics can be anything from, something that's been coming into support often. I wrote one about a year ago about, a lot of people want to use our search tweets Python library in R, and I figured out how to do it. And so I wrote a tutorial, and then I saw others on the forums sharing that tutorial, and it made me really happy because I wrote that because I was seeing it come up on our Twitter community forums over and over and over again. Anything that you got stuck on. This is something that I really like writing these tutorials, something that you're like, oh my God, I couldn't figure out how to do this and I got stuck. And, I, as a developer, often get stuck, and then figuring out how I get unstuck is what motivates me to keep going. But I've noticed that some of the things that I've gotten stuck on, others have gotten stuck on too. And so really writing a tutorial to kind of share that is pretty fun. Anything that you're excited about. So for me, one of my favorite tutorials I've ever written was how I solved my parking problem with Python. I was so excited to kind of tell this story of I had a problem in New York City. I was having issues because I was moving my car too much. I figured out how to create a technical solution to stop me from doing this. I was so excited to tell this story. And so if you are excited about it, others are going to be excited to kind of read that story. And also just anything that you built that you're proud of, where you're like, oh my God, like I built this thing, or anything that's like a good story to tell. I also have been really into like remixing others like work too lately, which is really fun. And I've had my work be remixed before too, and that's also something that's really fun. The basic rule of thumb that when I first started writing tutorials that I often think about is anything that you can't easily Google the solution for is probably a good tutorial. Um, and so, that's sort of kind of like my benchmark as I'm going is like, can this be easily Googled? Okay, it can't be like, cool, I'm going to try to write a tutorial for that. And also, like, someone else likely tried to solve the same problem or is trying to. So you really want to like create content that kind of can help make people's lives easier. So as you're writing your tutorial, I like to actually like at the beginning figure out like where am I going to publish this to? Because that helps you figure out who your audience is. And so some places that I commonly will publish content would be my company's website, my company's documentation, which is different, my company's blog, which is also different, dev.to, which is a site for developers, and it's kind of like a medium. It's like developer focused. It's really awesome, and they have a really good community. I'll write differently if I'm writing to that audience than I would to like my own company's website or our documentation. Um, and then also sometimes Medium as well and other places. Sometimes I'll do like, I used to have a website with a blog at one point. And so, just figuring out like where do you want this to live is like part of figuring out who your audience is, which helps you kind of figure out how to get started writing. So let's talk a little bit about how to get started. So let's go through some kind of questions that I like to ask myself as I'm getting started, which is like, so what is the goal of this? Like I'll often like write down on a piece of paper, like, okay, so what am I trying to help the reader accomplish? What will they walk away from knowing after they read this tutorial? What can they accomplish after this? And then also, who is my audience? Like, who am I writing towards? Am I writing towards an advanced developer? Am I writing towards a beginner developer? Am I writing towards a mid-level developer? Like, who am I writing towards? Because that will help me figure out the length too, right? And like how I'm going to go about it. Like, if it's a beginner audience, I'm going to make it more of like a recipe and more of like a guided journey as opposed to a more advanced developer where I might be like, here's the topic, get started, here's some resources. And so, or for like a mid-level developer, I might, have it be like, here's how I solve this problem and here's my code and walk you through like a very code-centric way of doing it. And so, for your audience, you really want to like figure out like who it is and who it is that you're writing towards and like experiment and play around too. Because you'll be able to kind of see if it's successful or not. I often think about this in narrative terms too. So like, what is the story that you're trying to tell with your tutorial? Like, did you just solve a problem and are you really excited about that? Or is it something different? Are you trying to prevent others from having the same problem that you had? Flow, from there we can actually get started kind of starting with the baseline. And so I like to think of this as like, I'm creating a house and I'm starting with the foundation. So really like for my drafts, I like to think of them as just like the most bare bones version of what the tutorial will be. And then I can refine it and build it later into a tutorial. So I want the skeleton that I can like build off of and turn into something bigger later on. And so the way that I like to do this is like with like actually starting with like the notes that I'm writing while I am writing code. And so a little while back, about maybe a couple of years ago, a former coworker of mine came up to me and was like, hey, Jess, I want to write a tutorial. Like, how do I even get started? And I was like, cool. And I want to write it on this cool code sample that I had. And I'm like, cool, do you have any notes? And it turned out that they had like all of these notes already written. And I was like, great, let's just take that and turn that into a tutorial. And so for me, I like to start with kind of like the notes that kind of like went through my own process. For me, I like to like think of myself as like the Nancy Drew of my own bugs. And I like to have all these like, like notes that I'm writing while I'm like solving problems and things like that. So I always have a notebook next to me. And, some of my early tutorials were just like literally typing up those notes and turning them into a tutorial. And, that's one way to kind of just get started, especially if you have that. Another thing, I actually gave a talk last year at Write the Docs about how I write sample code. And I talked about code having a narrative flow and having functions like paragraphs and using doc strings to kind of like have your code make sense as you're going. And so I've actually used that in this past year since then to actually kind of turn those notes and turn that into a tutorial. And I'll show you an example of that later, but like really working with the narrative flow to kind of like turn that into a tutorial is also a fun thing to do. Most of my content these days, I actually use a markdown file while I'm writing, and I just kind of take every code sample, everything I type in, and just kind of turn it into this giant thing that I can like, take what I need and turn it into something bigger and turn it into like a tutorial that makes more sense later on. So using that as kind of like this baseline really helps me kind of get started. I've also in the past used a screen reader, which I've found really fun, just to like record my process and then watch that and wrote the tutorial as I'm watching myself, which is really fascinating. Like I notice all these like errors about how I like what types of errors I get and like things that are really helpful. But yeah, using a screen reader to record yourself while you're writing code can be incredibly useful and helpful. Cool. So at this point, I actually want to show you some examples of writing that I found particularly inspiring that I've seen recently when it comes to tutorials. So let's start with actually one that I just recently made reference to, which is sending a response from the Twitter API to a spreadsheet in Google Sheets. So this is actually one that my colleague Daniele wrote a tutorial that was about how he used Google Sheets to make an API call from inside of Google Sheets. And I was like, oh, well, I want to send my data frame from pandas to Google Sheets all the time. And I keep on thinking about how I do this. And so I was like, oh, cool. I can like take his content and build off of it. And I kind of like that sort of like remix style tutorials a lot where you're like, oh, this other person had this creative idea, but like I can build off of it and put my own spin on it. And it is my own tutorial. It's similar in nature, but it's based on a code sample that I had. And so this one is actually one where I took the narrative structure of my own code and just turned it into a tutorial. I basically like took each of the sections and turned it into like a step-by-step tutorial. This is a mid-level tutorial, so it's not as like step-by-step, but it kind of walks you through like each of the things that you need to do to have a full code sample. So we start with our import statements. From there, we set up our environment variable, and then from there, we connect to the Twitter API. And then I basically wrote up what I was doing in each function as I went through it and turned it into a tutorial and got some pretty good traffic on this one. And then had this kind of like main section that I thought of as like a conclusion that kind of walked you through how to kind of tie everything together and just basically wrote out everything I did in the code and turned it into a tutorial. And that was something that was like really fun to work on. And I basically just started with my own code and turned it into something bigger. And so that was like a really fun way to kind of work off of that. I also saw this tutorial recently by Lizzie from Twilio, which is about detecting hair color with AutoML. And I was like, oh my God, this is so awesome. Like, I want to learn how to do this. I want to learn how to do that with text messaging and AutoML and JavaScript. Like, this is so exciting and engaging. I really want to learn how to do this. And so that was like that good story to tell that was just really like, pretty awesome. And then I really like on that particular content item, I really like some of the images that are used as well and how it actually kind of goes through sort of how you would kind of start to detect hair color in a really fun way. And it's something that's like such an interesting story. And I really enjoyed kind of like looking at that and reading that. I also really like this tutorial from Ali Spadell about how to build your first full stack app on AWS. It's a beginner friendly guide and it's a longer tutorial than some of the other ones that we've looked at so far. But what I really like about it is it's just step by step. I was able to actually use this tutorial and create an AWS Amplify project, which was super fun. and just it has kind of everything you need to like build this fully functioning thing. And as someone who had struggled in the past when I first got started building applications like this, having this sort of tutorial that like walks you through all the steps you need, and that's maybe a little bit of a longer read, can be really helpful. I also really like how there's a video component of this as well too. So that's something that, when I saw this, I really liked it, and it's like very clear in who it's spreading towards, and it's, a pretty interesting post. And then also, I really like this "What are GitHub Actions" post I saw recently. I recently actually used this to explain to a coworker what GitHub Actions are, and it talks a little bit about like what you would need. It's a pretty short tutorial, but it really just kind of walks you through, and it's part of a larger content series. And I really like that it's very short and to the point, and I could send it to a colleague, and it's very easy to kind of figure out exactly what GitHub Actions are really quickly. It has use of this GIF here that I really like as well too, and it just kind of uses images in a really great way to kind of like help you quickly understand what something is without having to go too deep into it. And there's also a video component to it as well, which I thought was pretty interesting. So those are some recent examples that I've really just enjoyed, and wanted to share with you of like content that I thought was good that could possibly inspire you. So once you kind of have sort of the start of your content and you're kind of built through it and you have a first draft ready to go, from there, I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about the review process. This is actually one of my favorite parts because I feel like I always start my content where like, it's very bare bones, it always needs something more. And I always like working with others to kind of show me what that can be. And so I really try to think really hard about like who my reviewers are once I have that first draft. And I'll do some stuff with timing too and trying to figure out like, okay, so who's going to review when, and I'll create like a review schedule so that we're not stepping on each other's toes and we're not, having long conversations in the threads. And so when I try to look at, who is going to review my document, in terms of for tutorials, I try to figure out who is a peer of mine, who's a subject matter expert, who's a beginner, and really trying to figure out like who can help me take what I have and take it to the next level. And then I often like to think about like, do I know anybody who is part of the audience that I'm trying to reach? This is something that can be really helpful, especially because, if I'm working with somebody who is creating their first full stack application, maybe I would share it with them. Or if I'm like writing something, for example, like what is GitHub Actions, maybe I'll share it with someone who doesn't know what GitHub Actions is, and to see if they're able to easily figure out what GitHub Actions are just based on my tutorial. So really trying to like figure out who you're writing towards, and if you know anybody who would review your writing. Before I joined a formal team, I would often have friends just review my writing, and I was surprised in who said yes to reviewing my writing. Like, I don't know, I wrote a piece about like my favorite Python resources, and I reached out to someone who didn't know Python but had been asking me about how to learn Python, and I was like, hey, I have this tutorial. Do you want to read it and let me know if like this answers your question? And they gave me some like really helpful feedback in that process. I wanted to talk to you about is being mindful of your overall vision during this part of the process. This is something I actually, when I first started allowing folks to kind of come in to help out with my review process, I was like really excited by everyone's feedback. And I was like, oh my God, like here are all these changes. And like, when folks make changes, I really like using track changes. And so, I'm really excited when people give me feedback and like really want to help me make my content better in this way. So I started accepting all of the suggestions that people had. And in some cases, I written some tutorials and I'm like, wait, this doesn't sound like me, or this has gone away from like the overall vision that I've had. And so that's something I want you to be mindful of. At the end of the day, this is your tutorial. This is your story that you're telling. And your name is going to be attached to it. So you really want to be mindful of like, yes, people are trying to be helpful and there's really good advice and suggestions, but you really want to make sure that you tie everything back to kind of your overall goals and vision for what you wanted your tutorial to look like at the beginning of the process. So really just be mindful of your overall vision and make sure that the changes and the suggestions that are being made are helping to improve your writing and that are like, staying in line with your own voice and your own kind of way of telling the story that you think is best. Because at the end of the day, it is your tutorial. So after you kind of have reviewed it, you've published your tutorial, you feel really good about it, you might be wondering, so like, what do I do now? What's the next step? So measuring success, yes, most sites have like views and like in some cases who clicked on the links and things like that. And so you can actually kind of see your traffic and use that as a measure of success. That's typically not the measure of success that I use. I often will keep track of people who told me that they were able to solve a problem because of my tutorial. People who have built something inspired by my tutorial. One of my most successful pieces of content, which was a tutorial about how I solved my parking problem with Python, inspired 6 other posts from others that had different like ways that they kind of took that problem and then turned it into their own unique thing. And I think that was like a really fun measure of success that we don't typically look at. Also, people who are able to build something based on what you've done is like a really cool measure. So really like looking beyond kind of the traditional, like how many people have looked at this post, into like how many people are asking me questions on our forums based on this post, like how many links are there on our support site on this, how many people have cloned the repository that this code comes from. Things like that are kind of things to like think of, like people are actually reading it and they're asking questions and they're engaged. Also pull requests to the code that accompanies the tutorial is sometimes another really fun like metric, being like, oh, someone tried to use this and ran into an issue and made a change. That is awesome. That's a really cool like measure of success. So thinking about it less about open rate or less about like traffic and views and more about like how many people have I helped accomplish do something is kind of the way that I like to measure how successful a tutorial is or isn't. Also, I've had the issue in the past year just because the Twitter API has gone through some changes recently, and some of my content is out of date. What the code that I was talking about a year ago is, I think, now retired at this conference. So I've had the experience of just having my code go out of date quickly. And so making sure that you're like looking at your code and like refreshing it as it gets out of date, or like pulling it down from places, or, just making sure that like, or creating new content that's inspired by it, because technical content can get out of date really quickly. Endpoints, if you're using an API, can be deprecated. A lot of things can change as time goes on. So really make sure that like you're keeping your content up to date and you're kind of every so often looking at like what you put out into the world and being like, hey, does this still work? Trying to follow your own tutorial. I've actually had the experience of trying to put myself in the shoes of a developer and using my own tutorial to solve a problem and finding some issues with my own tutorials that way too. So using that as a way to kind of like reframe and refresh and repost a new tutorial, it can be really fun. I did that with a content item that went out of date really quickly about analyzing the sentiment of my own tweets to see kind of how positive or negative my weeks were. And I like quickly like for a version bump changed the tutorial and then was like, oh, actually, like I can change all these other things too while I'm making this change. So it was really fun to kind of dig back in. Also, this is something I do all the time, which is think about like, how can I recycle this tutorial? Like I did the work, like what else can I do with it? So can it be a conference talk? Can I submit it to like PyCon if it's a Python language talk? Can it be a video? Did I learn something about writing? Can it be a talk for Write the Docs next year? Can it be a video that we produce that I link to? As I showed some of the content items that I like had video components. or can it be like a live stream? Can I live code this for an audience, right? Thinking about like how you can recycle your tutorial and build it into something more is really fun. And I like thinking of content these days as more of like an ecosystem rather than like I put something out into the world and then never do anything with it. I think of it more as like a commitment of like for every tutorial that I write, I probably will give it as a talk somewhere or as a live stream or something like that. So, or, did I learn a lot in the process of writing this content that it can be a talk for like write the docs next year? Yeah, cool. So in conclusion, I look forward to seeing what tutorials you create. Tutorials can be, one of my favorite ways of writing, and it also helped me become a better developer in addition to being a better writer. So it's been really helpful in my own journey of professional development in writing tutorials, and it's been one of my favorite ways to connect with developers. And I'm really excited to see what you build. So you can reach out to me at jgarson@twitter.com or again on Twitter at Jessica Garson. Also, if you have questions about the Twitter API, a lot of times people will ask me Twitter API specific questions at conferences like this. You can reach out to us at twittercommunity.com, or if you have content ideas, like just let us know, or you could tweet at us at TwitterDev, or if you want tutorials or things you want to see, just let us know. Thank you so much for letting me talk with you about one of my favorite topics, writing tutorials. Thanks again. This was really fun, and I look forward to reading some of your tutorials. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Woo! We're doing this live. We're watching people trickle in. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good.
Good. Yeah.
I was loving the discussion inside of the chat.
Yeah, so that said, 10 minutes with some wiggle room, but about 10 minutes for Q&A. There's been a lot of discussion about the difference between how-to guides and tutorials, which is not unexpected, although your talk focused on tutorials. Do you want to try to tackle that? The other questions first? What do you think?
I can talk about it now. I've been thinking about it just because there's been so much discussion like inside of the chat, and it's been like I've learned a lot from like reading others, reading what others were saying and listening. I really loved Kristen's definition of it, which is her take was tutorials are a way to learn a technique and explore, and how-tos are how to like quickly accomplish a task. Prior to this discussion, I actually mostly saw it as one and the same, like having it just depended a lot on who your audience was. So that like, for some audiences doing a very how-to like step-by-step guide might be better. And then for others, just having kind of a general overview, and it just was based on who you were talking to and like what you were trying to say and where you're planning on publishing the tutorial. But I really did learn a lot from the chat. So that was really cool. And I hadn't thought about that in the same way before.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. I mean, as I mentioned to you right before we got online for this Q&A session, you mentioned a colleague, I think at Twitter, named Daniele, and if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then our next speaker, Daniele Procida, who is also known for that framework with the comparison. So here we are.
Yeah, that was such a fun coincidence. I've seen Daniele's talk just as like someone who's been in the community for a little bit, and like and I also do have a colleague named Daniele, but they're different people. But I think they're two of my favorite Danieles. So yeah, that worked out so well. I'm really excited for Daniele's talk though. I'm really pumped.
Same here. Yeah. So we've got the questions trickling in. I'm going to rewind a little bit and probably look at some questions that were in the stage chat. Oh, Deanna's got a question about screenshots. How often do you use images or screenshots in tutorials, and how much is too much?
Yeah, that's a really great question. This is something that so when I first started writing tutorials, I was all about the screenshots. I was like, okay, cool, like step by step. And then, as products change and things move, it screenshots don't always stay in date. And so that's something that I've learned the hard way. And so, especially for like some products, directional language is the same way, right? Where you're like on this left-hand side and then it moves to the right-hand side. And then, your reader is like, oh my God, where's the button that I'm looking for? So I think as someone who's been burned by that in the past, I tend to lightly use screenshots, but I would like to use more. And I wonder like if others have ideas or suggestions about kind of how to make sure that like the screenshots that you're using are in date so that you don't always have to go and change screenshots every time that there is, a UI change or anything like that.
There was a bit of a discussion about that in the chat as well before we got I'm looking over at the spreadsheet that we've got that's collected a bunch of questions. Oh, to come back to I'm looking at a question from Ali Hajin, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. To come back briefly to the question of how-tos versus tutorials. Any idea for an umbrella term for how-tos plus tutorials?
Yeah, I kind of see, in terms of an umbrella term, how tutorial. I don't know. I don't really like that one, but like, but yeah, I think that like, again, I see it as more of like audience based. I recently was talking about my writing with somebody, and they were like, for this tutorial, like, I was wondering why you didn't have this be like more of a recipe, like step by step. And I think, for mid-level audiences, I personally like sometimes am turned off by that. Just myself as a developer. So I tend to like write in a way that's, more like, oh, like here's the code that I can cut and paste, and how do I like make this? And also my writing tends to be very like code based. So I'm typically writing about like how I did something with code. And so for that, I find that just like getting too much into the steps can sometimes take away from like the why. And so it just depends on who I'm writing towards and what I want to say.
Makes sense. Yeah, I found my brain flashing back to last year or last August with the presentation that you gave in 2020 with for writing or including sample code. So it's like these things, these two talks tie together, possibly.
Yeah, actually, that is true. This was actually the sequel talk to last year's talk. I think a couple people reached out to me after the talk, actually, with like really great feedback and advice and just suggestions, and wanted to talk more. And I was like, oh my God, I really want to talk. And like people were asking me about tutorials, and I was like, maybe for next year, I'll just submit the same talk, but about tutorials. So, and then it kind of grew into something different. But yeah, it was more kind of like the sequel. Like if I had a part two, I think it would have been this talk. So thank you so much for like giving me the opportunity to like have a part two to the talk. I've never done that before. So
Woo!
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure how often that happens with Write the Docs or with other conferences in general. So yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see, I question about measuring success, and I think a lot of us really enjoyed how you put it in terms of how many people I've helped. And so we got a question from Alexander. Yeah, so some of the nitty-gritty of metrics and so on. How do you measure success of your content in online communities where you don't have analytics for it and you can't get direct feedback from it? And there's more to that question, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, this is something that is like a really great question, because like, how do you know if it's successful or not? And, I think sometimes also in terms of like the jobs that we have where we do this, like proving our success is really important, right? And so, one of the things that I think is really interesting is like, most places where you post, there's like Google Analytics for dev.to, they give you some metrics of like views, traffic of some sort, like how many people clicked on like what link, right? And things like that. And that's really helpful. But in not every case, not every tool has robust analytics, as you know, like, and so like, I've started being creative about tracking like inbounds about the tutorial. And I actually have like numbers of that, like, how many times was this link referenced on our support channels or things like that. So, there definitely are things that you can do even if you don't have robust analytics and like ways to kind of like see if people are reading it, and like no one is going to ask you about it if they haven't read it. And then also just like, from there, figuring out what's helpful. I typically use for like presentations and things like that, a kind of a little bit of like, I look to see how many people click on my last link inside of my content, just because that shows me who's reading to the end, which is really interesting as well. So.
Very cool. So we do have a couple minutes left. I think we'll just get to one more question before we begin to wrap things up. Probably not going to get to the question from Scott about solving the parking problem right now, but I wanted to get to Danielle in this room. How apt. He says, you seem to really enjoy writing tutorials, Jessica, and to get a lot out of the experience. And it sounds to me from the way you speak about it that it's basically because you like users. How do you put yourself in that frame of mind?
Yeah, I do like users. And then also, I'm lucky enough that I'm a user of the product that I get to write about. So a lot of times it's just actually like doing the task and being like, oh my God, like, like what am I doing and where is it going wrong? And also like user interviews really helps too. Like one of the things that I've been trying to do this past year is get to know our users better. And that's sort of been a goal of mine is like, having a lot of one-on-ones and like, hearing what they're working on will always inspire me. And I just love like learning about how people are actually using the product. Cause I think, as someone who sits in product meetings sometimes, like a lot of times we think about it in abstract terms and it's very different from people's like everyday experience. And, just trying to get into that framework. And then also my job is a little bit different than the typical user. And so sometimes I need to be mindful that I am not the typical Twitter API user for, the product that I'm working on, and just being very aware of like where those limitations are and like things like that, and how it would be different if I was the typical end user of the product.
Okay. Okay. I'm looking at the time. We've got several more questions. Alyssa, Jessica, and Judy, and Alexander. So 2 questions from me to you. Could you reiterate again what might be a good way for people to get in touch with you with those questions? And is there anything else you'd like to share with everybody?
One, you can reach out to me at jgarson@twitter.com, or in my Twitter DMs, they're open. So just send me a DM, and they can be a little bit busy. So if I don't get back to you right away, don't be offended. It's I do get a lot of DMs, but feel free to always send me a DM with any questions. And then also there's a chat function in here too. So I know a couple of people have used that last year too. So feel free to put that in there.
Thank you so much.